Right? Yeah.
Okay. Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, joined again by Keith Preston, Swithun, Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. Today's discussion will be how radical will a libertarian society actually be? And this sort of was germinating in a talk that I did with Swithun just a few days ago. One of them was he mentioned that a lot of plumb-line libertarians and right libertarians they'll say, well, libertarian society is not like today, just without the state, which doesn't really take into account how much the state actually does determine the current economic and social conditions we're living in now. Kevin Carson would call that vulgar libertarianism, which is further leads to the argument over thick versus plumb line. Originally, it was the left libertarians with people like Kevin Carson and C4SS, but arguably you could argue that Hoppe is kind of a thick libertarian of the right. And so then, is plumb line libertarianism, is it even actionable? Could that even be a society we could live in? And if it isn't, and you need more than that, what might that be? And then second of all, this is something you mentioned, Keith, once when Kyle Kalinske was asked why he wasn't a radical anarchist or a radical socialist. He said, well, when I get up in the morning and get some coffee and go to work, I don't even know what that world would look like. What am I doing? Like, they can't even tell you. And I think all of that just puts an exclamation point on the question. How different, how radical would a libertarian society be? Now, I think the earliest writings of Rothbard from like his days when he was flirting with SDS, he would have argued, and I think correctly, that it would have been very radical. It would have been as radical to the current status quo as far as being different as, say, the socialists were to the traditional societies of Europe that they were criticizing. It's not just get rid of a few things here and there and it's going to be more or less the same. It's going to be radically and totally different. Few of the socialists saw how radically different it would be. I think maybe Bakunin probably came the closest, where he said that state socialism would be the greatest tyranny of all time. You put a revolutionary in the role of the czar and he'd become the worst tyrant in history, but not too many saw that far ahead. And nobody's really been able to figure out what a left libertarian society would look like over any great length of time. And so I think the first thing then would be with plumb line libertarianism is there enough? Because to be honest, one of the most recent memory, by recent I mean like the last 10 years, within recent memory, one of the most, I think, interesting attempts at exploring the radical nature of libertarianism was a series of lectures given by Walter Block called Radical Austrianism, Radical Libertarianism. Now, of course, most of what he's writing about here are financial, though a few of these deal with culture, abortion and reparations, for example, and environmentalism. And then also his book, Defending the Undefendable, where he sort of shows that in an authentically libertarian society, there'd be a lot of behaviors and professions that most people find unacceptable, but as long as they're NAP compliant, would exist. So I guess starting with that, Swithun, what would your thoughts be on this whole question?
Well, I think any radical libertarian left libs, plumb line, or right is going to be massively different from what we currently have. Just to bolster your point, I on another show I did an episode entitled it was something that was like in defense of, it was about wage slavery, and I posted it on some like libertarian Austrian places, and they all went insane about how I was all a Marxist. I must be a Marxist because I'm talking about wage slavery. It's like, well, do we really have a free market? No, we don't. Do you think it's possible that workers have a worse bargaining position now because of like state restrictions stuff? Yeah. But it's all talked about, by like all the classical liberal thinkers and stuff. It's like, well, you don't ever talk about it. And as soon as anyone brings anything up that the current system might not be perfect, it's like when you're all going to defend and shill for the corporations. So it is very much of a problem. And Carson is right with his term vulgar libertarian. Now, what would a broadly more radical libertarian society look like, economically speaking? Well, there's a whole host of things I could possibly talk about here. This is going to be somewhat speculative for obvious reasons. But I think Kevin Carson's work with respect to infrastructure spending by the state is at least interesting here. Carson notes, makes a claim effectively that organizations like Amazon, for instance, would not be able to exist in a libertarian society because, well, all those roads probably wouldn't have been built. And if they were, then Amazon would have to pay for their use rather than basically having a zero cost for couriering, for at least going on the roads, on the freeways, as it were. Because, as you probably did know, a lot of the interstate road building was done for ostensibly military purposes after the Second World War. And the state has, for a long time, if I remember what Sean Gabb argued, that they subsidize the underwrite insurance contracts for international shipping. They obviously spend a hell of a lot of money on trains, on roads, etc. And this is going to make shifting of goods in particular a lot cheaper over longer distances. So whilst you might think, for instance, that the large corporation with centralized production and then massive distances traveled in distribution would necessarily be the economic model of a libertarian society, that I actually think is somewhat dubious. I mean, just for an example of how expensive these things are, for a single track road in England, it costs £10 million per mile. Now, on a motorway for 3 lanes, that's 30 million. I'm going to go both ways, that's 60 million pounds per mile. The high-speed rail that they're building, which is a complete joke, called HS2, is currently running at 300 million pounds a mile. Now, this isn't to say that you couldn't build any rail. This is not to say that you couldn't build any road infrastructure voluntarily or without eminent domain, but rather to say is, well, they're going to be pretty darn expensive. And you're going to need to forecast a significant amount of traffic to make them possible. What alerted me originally to how expensive road building was watching an old car program about 10, 15 years ago. They went to the South Island in New Zealand, and they don't actually have tarmac roads to a large extent there. They have gravel roads instead, and they have 4x4s because the population density is too low to make it viable to actually have a standard what you would consider a road. And so it makes more sense then for the increased costs of travel to be borne by the individual and having a more robust car that he can travel over this distance. So I would expect then when it comes to transport, for instance, especially with people, a libertarian society is probably going to have much more emphasis on flying. Because flying is actually relatively cheap for the one reason that you don't need to maintain the sky. What I've pointed out with roads is just building it, let alone the maintenance costs. I mean, as an aside, I'm pretty sure if you've ever come across the organization called Strong Towns, they go on a lot about how the sort of like road and other infrastructure is incredibly expensive to maintain for the local city government. And this is going to be it's a massive drain on the taxpayer because just maintaining it over time is very, very, very expensive. So I think you have much more emphasis on flying, and as Todd, as you point in the chat, also sea, because sea travel is always pretty cheap and quick. By far, the cheapest way of getting any goods transported is via boat. And basically, up until like the 17th century, the major way of transporting anything was by waterways, because on road transport was just either very slow. It was quicker, but the quality of the road was really poor in horses and cart and things. Even though you built turnpikes, they were okay, but they were nothing in comparison to what we have today. So the standard sort of model of shipping things around and then distributing on trucks, I mean, yeah, of course it's possible, but I mean, you're probably not going to do it over such a long distance. This also brings me to the point that libertarians generally we're pro-free trade, and what this really means is we want more international trade. But then the question arises, if you actually had free trade in a genuine sense without subsidy, would you have as much international trade? And I think in certain circumstances, well, you would still have it if they have things that you don't. But I would expect that given the transportation cost, the relative cost increase, you're going to have relatively more localized production and distribution. Oh, as an aside, this is more sort of libertarian futurism on the fact that air travel is going to be significantly, relatively more important. I wouldn't be surprised if flying cars were invented. According to a guy called J. Storrs Hall, who wrote a book on basically why don't I have a flying car yet, one of his major reasons for it was the increase in regulation and energy cost increase, since effectively the US government and the Western governments basically made it more difficult to produce energy, probably from like the late 70s and 80s. Although that said, of course, that's all based on centralized electricity production and sent via a grid. Again, would you have such a system? I don't think so necessarily. Until we had the national grid in England, they had various regional ones. I think it was only when it was nationalized was it made central. You had various regional grids instead. And I think those, I can't remember who produced them, but you did have various underground grids being produced. I think the first one was in Manchester in the mid-19th century, but obviously it was relatively localized. Then again, you've got the question as to what extent you would urbanize and how dense the population would be. Obviously with enclosures and stuff, increasing the amount of urbanization stuff in the 19th century. So that's another question. So I think I've gone on for enough, at least to begin with. But I think Carson's point, which I think any sort of libertarian in the plumb line would actually recognize, is that transportation costs are vastly subsidized by the state, which increases the viability of large-scale mass production and distribution, and makes that relatively cheaper than would otherwise exist. And so, at least on that level, I think you're going to get a relatively more localized production and distribution system.
All right, Keith Preston.
I think an interesting thought experiment related to this would be something like this. Let's say that all of the governments around the world got together in some kind of UN forum and said, okay, we're not going to do anything anymore. We're all going to just step aside. And they all told their people of their respective countries, well, good luck to you. You're on your own from here on out. We're not going to print money anymore. We're not going to build any more infrastructure. We're not going to issue patents. We're not going to deliver the mail. We're not going to do anything. You're on your own. So what would happen? Well, immediately there would probably be chaos. But in the long run, what would happen? In the long run, I think we would see a world much different than what we're accustomed to in this kind of situation. The big issue that the left libertarians raise against the right libertarians is this idea, well, you couldn't really have capitalism as conventionally understood without the state. You couldn't have big transnational corporations and the big banking cartels and all that kind of stuff that is part of capitalism today. There's a question of whether we would have Microsoft, whether we would have McDonald's, whether we would have Walmart and all of these places. And I do tend to think that the left libertarians are probably right in the sense that if you simply did away with the patent laws and trademark laws and intellectual property rights and copyright laws and that kind of stuff that all of these organizations get, I don't see how those could exist on the scale that they do. For instance, in a system like that, anybody that wanted to could pretty much start their own McDonald's. They could call it a McDonald's and use the Ronald McDonald logo and the golden arches and all that if that's what they wanted to do. And the McDonald's company couldn't say a word about it. Just like to my knowledge, there's nobody anywhere who says, well, you can't sell tomatoes because these people over here already sell tomatoes or something like that. So just getting rid of that alone, all of those different categories of intellectual property, I think would change a lot of things. If you did away with the centralization of currency production and basically said you can use anything you want as a unit of exchange, you can use seashells, you can use gravels, you can use, marijuana cigarettes or whatever, I think that would certainly have a fairly significant ripple effect throughout economic life. Merely getting rid of subsidies to corporations, what's commonly called corporate welfare, I think that would be one. As far as the fuel industry, that one is interesting because I don't think the American fuel industry, the petroleum industry, could exist without the state. At least it couldn't exist in its present form. And as to how that would affect fuel production and fuel cost, I'm not sure. I'm inclined to think that at least in North America, without all that, I think fuel costs might actually go up, which might actually be a deterrent to the use of fuel. You might find people looking for other ways of travel that aren't as fuel heavy in terms of consumption. I'm not certain about that, but it's a possibility. If government did not build roads, if people had to travel on whatever roads that they built for themselves or within the context of voluntary groups, I think a common argument against libertarians and anarchists is, well, who will build the roads? That's like one of the standard comebacks. And my response to that has always been, well, who cares? We already have enough roads. But I do think it's true, though, that without government subsidizing transportation infrastructure or maintaining transportation infrastructure, you may well see less travel. You may see people becoming somewhat more static. Whether that would have the effect of raising or lowering transportation costs, I'm not sure, but I'm not certain that it wouldn't be a disincentive to travel. Carson's idea is that in this kind of economy, you'd have a system of localized production for localized usage for a whole lot of consumer goods that are otherwise not produced or consumed in that way. And that may be true, and if that's the case, I think that you would see a more static population, in the sense people wouldn't move around as much. Like nowadays, here in North America, at least, nobody lives in the neighborhood they grew up in anymore. A lot of people don't even live in the city they grew up in anymore. People change residences every few years and move from city to city. And in a more localized economy, I don't know that would be the case. And that I think also gets to the cultural implications of that. Like you have this big debate between the left and right libertarians about, well, what kind of culture would you have in a libertarian society? And of course, the left libertarians, it's basically they want to have the woke culture, the rainbow culture, and all of that. And then the Hoppians want to have the traditional bourgeois, the Victorian type of culture. I don't know that either one of those would be dominant. I tend to think a better model would be something like what you found in a lot of societies prior to colonialization, where all over the world, if you look at all the different types of indigenous societies, you see a huge amount of diversity among them in terms of culture, religion, styles of dress, food, all kinds of things. So I think you'd see a kind of localized cultural homogeneity, but on a meta level, ultra diversity. Not to say there would never be localized diversity as well. I mean, you might have some places that were as diverse as, say, the Creature Cantina scene in Star Wars or something. But I don't think that this kind of woke version of diversity would necessarily be dominant. But I'm not certain that like 19th century bourgeois Victorian social norms would be dominant either. I think it would be something beyond either one of those.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, let's with regards to this question of what are the prospects of a libertarian society, either with this more plumb line orientation or a more right orientation, I wanted to riff off of something that Swithun mentioned earlier, and I think it's clear that no matter which of those groups were in power, the entities like Amazon, Walmart, or Google and Apple would either take on a far less influential role in that society, or they would likely dissolve entirely. I just think that in no matter what libertarian society that is in question, that these massive corporate entities just wouldn't wield the power that they do in this sort of mixed economy and society that we have now in the United States. Something that Keith mentioned that I believe is true is that certain industries seem to have a heavy dependency on government subsidies like fossil fuels and transportation, as well as things like space travel. And with that, I'm alluding to government contracts being won by companies like SpaceX and so forth, because I think we can agree that NASA is done for the time being with space travel. those things would probably still exist per se, but those pursuits and those industries would be far more expensive, and they would be they would have to find their own source of funding, and it would be more of an exclusive type of a financial pursuit rather than something that the government is just willing to hand out contracts for. So those things would take on an entirely I guess they would take on an entirely different role altogether. With regards to how either of these societies would manage these various cultural issues, well, I think Keith and Swithun both touched on this, which I think is accurate. I think a left libertarian society, I mean, there would be this, of course, this heavy emphasis on cultural enforcement of LGBTQ sort of, I don't know, that there'd be cultural laws in place, but that would certainly be, a part of the whole ethos of, that these people are just as important as, the traditional family and so forth. So that would be being piped out fairly loud. I think we could agree. And I think the economic orientation of a left libertarian society would be something like an anarcho-syndicalist or an anarcho-socialist type of economy. I think as for the right libertarian society, it'd be something more like a local capitalistic economy, maybe something like a Tom Woods economic model. And there would probably be something more, and this is kind of coming off of the our boy Triple H, Hans Hermann Hoppe type of a cultural enforcement. It would be something like the enforcement of immigration laws, probably tax incentives that support a traditional family, probably a bit more pro-free trade, probably less bureaucracy involved. And something Swithun said that's interesting as well is that there would be more locally made goods, but that would open up the possibility for more expensive international goods that would be coming into that society. So those are just my initial thoughts on that question.
Yes. Now, there's a lot to go with here, but I think another thing that needs to be emphasized is that such a society would be much smaller than it is today. So, given that libertarians of all stripes reject the idea of fractional reserve lending and banking, modern day mass society is the result of this ability to just get money out of thin air. If we look at the beginning of the banking system of England, one of the reasons why government public debt was institutionalized was because the gentry, the landowners, and other supporters of the government got a steady, predictable return from that debt. And as long as that debt was there, they would make handsome profits off of it. So that's of course how they were able to finance, firstly, the what's called the First English Empire, the First British Empire, which goes from like 1700 to the American Revolution. And what does that mean? Well, almost everything we have now is the result of the ease of finance. Finance throughout all of history was very difficult. As libertarians point out, the earliest forms of finance were either, well, before the first coinage from Lydia, it was barter, right? Exchanging goods and services without any sort of intermediary. But then with the rise of coinage in Lydia, you became coins. But you're still limited, even if you clip the coins, even if you fake the coins, there's still a hard limit to how many coins you can issue. And so financing, the money supply was very rigid. Whereas with banking, the money supply now is bloated beyond all sense of proportion. But that allows for a lot of things. It allows for a large government. It allows for the technical progress. So I actually think that a libertarian society would be low tech, because I believe that there's a threshold for a technological investment, which, why is it that technology started to skyrocket, after around 1700? Well, I think in part because the ability to finance it was a lot easier. Prior to 1700, even financing the state was extremely difficult. And then furthermore, if the state's smaller or rather non-existent, then who's going to be paying for R&D? I mean, R&D as a systematic, rational process was done by the U.S. government after World War II. And so it's the government that is creating the demand and the money for this, but all of which is tied into the ease of financing due to fractional reserve lending. So if that's gone, I think everything's just going to be a lot smaller and a lot more low tech, because there's a threshold below which you can't do this, and that threshold is a certain amount of financial flexibility that wouldn't exist if you don't have fractional reserve lending. Now the question might be, well, maybe we've got to a point in history where there's just so much technology out there right now that's, grassroots enough, like 3D printing, that even if we get rid of fractional reserve lending, we're never going to go back to the proverbial dark ages. Maybe, but certainly any sort of large scale development on the par we've seen today, I don't think would happen. I think technological progress would screech to a halt. I mean, you may think that's bad, you may not think that's bad. Some would fall on either side of that camp. The other thing that I foresee is that there wouldn't be a lot of international trade. It's something that Swithun brought up. For the main reason that whether it's over land like the traditional Silk Road, or over sea lanes like in the ancient Mediterranean or in the early modern period with the Great Age of Exploration, it takes a huge amount of capital investment to protect those routes, usually by the state. The Silk Road's success rose and fell depending on the strength of the empires that controlled the region from Syria to China. And if those empires were strong, trade could happen. But when those empires were weak or non-existent, trade dried up. And usually what ended up happening, those empires started to falter because the cost of maintaining the trade routes, they kept on raising the price because they could. And of course, because they could, it became prohibitively difficult to make the trips. And with shipping, long global shipping, I mean, whether it's beginning with the Great Age of Exploration with the Dutch and then the British and then the Americans, it takes naval hegemony to protect the shipping, not just your own, but international shipping from piracy and rogue states. And so I think that those things would be likely not to be produced in a libertarian society on that scale. So I think I would agree with Carson that a lot of this would be small scale, local production, and trade wouldn't really much go beyond, the next hill or two, because it's too far and too difficult to do. I also think that culturally speaking, such a society would be broadly right-leaning, because as you've mentioned, Keith, a lot of these left-wing moral panics are only the result of affluence and boredom. Like if you're trying to just survive with food and keep clothes and shelter, then you don't have time for this. And if we assume a concomitant decline in material conditions, then the political left just won't really exist. To the extent the political left exists, it would only exist in, I think, one way: the equal distribution of resources. Because you can theoretically, even in antiquity, see the in maldistribution of resources between the nobles and the king on the one hand, and then the people on the other, or the merchants on the one hand, and the people on the other. But that would be a more narrow economic socialism. I don't think you'd see this cultural socialism because, again, sort of as you said, Keith, the material conditions aren't there for it. And so I would say everything's going to be smaller. It's going to be local. You're not going to have global trade. You're not going to have a lot of R&D for technological development, and you're going to have a society that trends right. That doesn't determine exactly what that's going to be, but yeah. So Swithun.
Okay, so when it comes to finance, yes, I do think that the fractional reserve system, say from post the late 17th century onwards, made it easier to finance projects that would otherwise would have been more difficult to finance because it was cheaper. But you've got to remember, though, that you can only invest to the extent to which you have saved the resources to begin with. So ultimately, whilst it may have allowed more centralized production of things, it doesn't necessarily mean, well, unless you're going to make a claim that that sort of is more productive in and of itself, I don't think that necessarily implies that you're going to have more investments in a fractional reserve system. Rather, relative to, say, a full reserve banking system. It's just rather it'll be in a different manner. And also, if you take to the Austrian claim that really if one of the aspects of the business cycle is that the credit cycle, more precisely, is that the increase in the money supply from the fractional system makes it look like there are more resources to invest than there actually are. And so even though it looks like you can invest more, you actually don't have those resources. So I think the point with respect to the banking system needs to be somewhat more nuanced. As to the point about why do you get the technological development from the 18th century, well, that's always a big question with respect to the Industrial Revolution as such. An interesting argument has been made. Farewell to Arms. I can't remember the author's name. Who basically says
Hemingway?
No. It's a cognitive researcher. I can't remember his name. Basically, he claims that the birth rates amongst the merchant class, the survivable number of children was a lot higher, and he does this by looking at surnames. And what were obscure merchant surnames in the 15th, 16th century became much more predominant later on. And effectively, his argument, now, maybe he doesn't actually make this argument, but the interpreters of him have. Effectively, what you do, you have a genetic uplift from the 16th century onwards, because basically the more intelligent middle and upper middle classes' birth rates outdo the poor. And so the relatively more intelligent marry downwards, which gives you a general uplift in average IQ. And then these sort of conditions then produce the conditions for the Industrial Revolution, at least in part, because effectively you have widespread higher levels of average intelligence. And then these start to go down again when sort of infant mortality goes down in like the mid 19th century, and that's all the stuff written by people like Francis Galton, etc. So it's in that sort of position. So that's an interesting claim. With respect to R&D spending, with the absence of intellectual property law, I actually think libertarian society, in a sense, would be more technologically advanced, although it depends how they would be. Even though the state has put lots of money into R&D, the question is how much has been that useful for civilian use. I mean, so for instance, you can claim the Americans great advances with respect to the space program, but I'm pretty sure the only thing you got from that was Velcro. Now, there may well have been more than that. Also, if I remember correctly, even the GPS system, which was developed by the American military, needed significant alteration for domestic use. And if the tax rates had been that level lower, you would then have been able to use those for investment. So I don't actually think that the libertarian society would necessarily be less technologically sophisticated. I think the forms of technological development would have been different. I don't necessarily think you would develop nuclear weapons, for instance, because that's very much a highly centralized production method, but weaponry system. So I think you would have had different incentives. But I would defend it on its technological development, even though saying I do think it would be relatively localized, but for different reasons. Also, with the defense of shipping lanes, I do think they would be relatively expensive. You get fewer of them, but that's not because the private sector couldn't do it. It's just because it'd be cheaper to do it internally. So an example I was given by historian Matteo Slonia, an example of sort of private defense of shipping lanes is in the first half of the 16th century in the Western Mediterranean. The Spanish needed to help defend themselves from incursions from North Africa, and they basically asked the Doria family and the Grimaldi family, who were moneylenders and grain merchants who traded from around the Mediterranean area, to use their private galleys to defend them, because they defended their own routes to begin with, and they were so good that the Spanish government decided that can we use them to fight off the Muslims. So I do think there's evidence for that. So that's just as a bit of response to Todd. On the culture aspect, one thing I do think would be interesting in a libertarian society is I do think it would be much less age segregated than we have today, primarily in the absence of child labor laws. I think, and also compulsory mass schooling. I don't, obviously, I think education of a sort would exist, but whether mass schooling would exist in the same way, I think is highly unlikely, to put it mildly, especially when you don't need licenses and stuff to do certain jobs which require you to do particular qualifications, which the state have mandated that you do. And so everyone, and then subsidize you to do them at a younger age. In the absence of those, I mean, the whole raison d'etre for the system, which is to go and get your qualifications so you can do a particular job, wouldn't particularly exist. So I would expect, especially from, say, the teenage years, you're going to get many, many more sort of 12, 13-year-olds in the labor force. And this would create a significantly different culture than you have today, whereby you have large levels of sort of age segregation in society. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing is another question, but I do think you're going to get a lot more younger people working alongside 20s, 30s, and obviously older than you get today, which will be interesting. Oh, and also I imagine you get older ones, because I mean, you probably, well, I mean, I suppose you could retire in the same way, but whether you would or not is another question. You might ramp it down, but again, I think, again, it would ape sort of a relatively more pre-modern condition in certain respects, with respect to the ages that people worked and with whom they worked. So I think, along with the relatively less mobile nature of society to some extent, although I do think they would move with flying and things like that, the age profile of the society and what they did at certain ages and things would be more broad. And so I think that would have an interesting cultural change. As to how it would change, I'm not entirely sure, but it would make a difference.
All right, Keith Preston.
Well, I tend to agree with a lot of what Todd said earlier, but not entirely so. I think that the kind of systems we're talking about here would produce a lot of extreme dichotomies. For instance, when we look at the effect of the centralization of political power and economic power, and along with that comes the centralization of cultural power, and you have efforts to impose a certain monocultural system on a large group of people. Without the kind of institutions we're criticizing, or that he's talking about, that none of that would be possible. So I think that the more decentralized political and economic and cultural power becomes, the more not only do you see more diversity, but you also see more extreme dichotomies. For instance, I've had people tell me before that they don't like my idea of pan-secessionism, like breaking up the United States into multiple countries. And there's a lot of reasons they'll give for that. But one reason I've heard quite a bit is, well, that will just fuel the extremes. Instead of having this kind of centrist society we have now, you'll have the blue states will be communist and the red states will be fascist or something like that. And I think there's some truth to that, in the sense that the more decentralization of power you have, the more diversity you have, but also the more extreme dichotomies tend to develop. And also, we have some historical prototypes for what societies that weren't able to develop a huge concentration of power actually looked like. One is Greece. Ancient Greece was just a collection of cities, and you never really developed an overarching Greek empire. Well, you had Alexander that tried, and with varying degrees of luck. And then, centuries later, you had the Roman culture that emerged out of that. But because of its geographical circumstances and a number of other things, Greece was not able to develop an overarching centralized power system. But Greece was also extremely advanced culturally and in many ways economically and scientifically for its time. It wasn't some backward, primitive society. It was more advanced than even a lot of societies that came centuries later. At the same time, in Greece, you tended to have a situation where Athens tended to dominate trade and was sort of the center of education and learning and things like that. And you had other places in Greece, and certainly in the outlying areas around Greece, that were very, very backward, even by ancient standards. And I think the kind of thing we're talking about here would in many ways resemble that, in the sense that you would probably have certain centers of extreme economic and technological development. You would have like a modern version of Athens where you have people, building spaceships and flying cars, and people trying to develop plans for oceanic countries and subterranean colonies, and dome cities on the Arctic, and flying space stations and all that kind of stuff. And to some degree, that kind of thing might become a reality. But then I think when it came to other people, and I think this would happen for economic and technological reasons as well as for cultural reasons, you would have, the hinterlands might well become places where people are living more like they did in the medieval period. And then the far hinterlands might even be almost primitivist, almost prehistoric in terms of how people are living. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that the libertarian science fiction fans who envision a libertarian world of space colonies, and then the anarcho-primitivists like John Zerzan who want to go back to the Pleistocene or whatever, I think both of them would probably end up getting their wish up to a certain point. I think you see these kinds of extreme dichotomies developing, but not when it comes to not only economic arrangements, you probably see extreme collectivism in some instances and extreme individualism in other ways. You would probably see extreme cultural conservatism, and I don't know what the opposite of that would be. Extreme cultural, if not libertinism, things that are unlike what we know now develop as well. I think that if technological capabilities developed to the point where it became radically different over a rapid period of time, you would probably see a backlash against that. For instance, let's say we got to the point where we were developing space colonies, and we could do things like, somebody gets their arm amputated in an accident, so you can grow a new arm, and you have people that are like, consider themselves trans species, so they're being genetically altered into with some dog genes or something and becoming dog people. I think if that happened, you would see a big backlash against that, where a lot of other people would say, "Wait a minute, this is just we're not even human anymore. We're losing our whatever. We're losing the universe." And you would have people seeking to go back to very traditional ways of living, anti-technology, traditional religion, whatever conception of some kind of traditional culture, traditional family we have. So again, I think you'd see these extreme dichotomies. You'd see the genetically altered dog people, and then you'd see people who want to live like their people in the Middle Ages lived, or something like that, or proliferation of Amish type societies. Whether all this is good or bad is I guess debatable, but this is I kind of think this is how it would end up turning out in the long run.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, one thing that you mentioned, Todd, which I think is interesting, is this idea that everything would be smaller in scale with regards to things like trade and technology, finance, left-wing moral crusades, and corporate dominance of markets and things like that. I think, mass society, I think we could probably agree on, is highly dependent on the availability of credit and loans and things like that. It would be interesting to see what the negation of that variable would look like. I think you would see far less frivolous spending among the middle and upper classes and things like that. And to Keith's more recent point, I think it's clear that, in addition to what he had listed off, I think it's clear that more extreme cultural dichotomies would certainly materialize as well. Because I think, this centralized society is, I think it's fairly clear through, the modern HR department and the sameness of, commercials everywhere, and just the way that products and entertainment are foisted onto the public. You can kind of tell that there's this abstract attempt to make people more similar to each other rather than different. So if you take away that big global financial system that enforces that, well, you'd have everything from things like, the Seattle Chaz reemerging, or you'd have, dissident alt-right guys in pickup trucks in Texas, driving around with guns and, and enforcing their territory. And, you'd have, and everything in between that. So, yeah. And with regards to technology, I think that's an interesting question. For me, it's difficult to tell what would remain from a post global capitalistic system, if the world were to go libertarian in this hypothetical scenario. But I think clearly the knowledge and the technology would still be around, but it would have to find a new way of financing itself rather than these centrally these mixed economies and these large centrally organized entities financing them. I think Keith had an interesting point that there would be only a few places in the world where that would happen, and probably the United States, China, and Europe would probably have the the space travel and the aerospace technology kind of residing there. But just how far or just how advanced that technology becomes, I think would be highly dependent on how well it can finance itself. But if it's done on a local level, I don't know, that's difficult for me to answer, but it would remain to be seen. Trying to think of any other point I was trying to bring up here, but I think that was an interesting point that Keith had. But I think I would agree to a certain extent that a lot of these extreme dichotomies would materialize, but the cultural dichotomies, I think, would be very accented, and there'd be I think the coastal cities would be highly left. I think a lot of the rural areas would be more traditional and more right leaning, and it's tough to say what would be in the middle. I think maybe some type of local centrist type of like a right-leaning, maybe a Hapa kind of society that's open to like internal migration, but would still have some cultural laws that favor a more traditional family and that sort of a thing. And I agree with Todd that these large left-wing moral crusades wouldn't have the material conditions that they enjoy now under a global capitalistic system. People simply wouldn't have time for it, and the priorities of the lives of daily people would completely shift, and there wouldn't be there wouldn't be cartoons with gay pride flags. So yeah, sorry, lefties.
So for the final statements, I'll ask you this, Swithun. What does day one in Hapastan look like? You're going to work. How does a day in the life of a citizen of Hapastan look?
That's an interesting question. One of the first things that might seem, I think probably in many cases, although not necessarily in the biggest urban centers, you go to work and people would look like you. Because you're probably going to get higher levels of ethnocentrism, especially if they're not moving as much. You're going to expect, as it were, greater levels of genetic difference between each areas, because the genetic pools aren't mixed in the same way as they are today, and that might link to higher levels of sort of positive and negative ethnocentrism. So that would be one thing. If you go to work, would you go in a car? I don't necessarily think so. There may be some localized forms of mass transit. If you need to go any medium distance, you might use your flying car. If you need to go on a long distance, you're probably going to go in a proper plane in most cases, because you can split the cost of the fuel over a long distance. How else is it going to look? Will you have beyond that, that's really hard to say. I expect population densities maybe not be, probably no, they would not be as high. So I don't think on average you're likely to get huge numbers of people in any one place. Actually, you could do, because those are the places in which it might make sense to build like a grid system, and rather than everyone having their own sort of separate sort of septic tanks and all the sort of plumbing issues that you might have. Although obviously this is assuming that you started in Hopperville to begin with, because as Keith points out, what happens if you stop everything now? Clearly you've lots of stuff we can still use, And so these sorts of changes would take place over time, because you're not just going to get mass deurbanization, at least not immediately. If people stop, maintaining the roads, they'll just get fed up and sort of eventually move out somewhere else, or you're going to get some gradual changes. So the first thing I can think of really is, you go to work. Well, even if you go to work, you may well be self-employed. You may work in your own home, and you could well have a greater integration of domestic and commercial activity, because there's no zoning laws. To a large extent, the segregation of domestic and commercial enterprise is because of zoning regulations. In the absence of those, again, might make sense to do that. And I think, actually, as an aside, that's what you're kind of getting in the sort of post-industrial internet age, where home working and is much easier and available even to people who are self-employed. And so I think even with that, you're getting a reintegration to something similar, although not the same, as a more of a pre-industrial rather than the post-industrial model, where everything's quite separated. So yes, those have been my initial thoughts on that.
All right, Keith, this is what does it look like in a libertarian society? Just a day in the life.
Well, I think that's going to depend largely on where you are and who you're with. If you're in the anarcho-primitivist society, you're going to go out and look for berries and fruit to pick off the tree, or look for animals to spear or something like that. If you're on the libertarian space colony, the first thing you're going to need to do is make sure oxygen and gravity levels have been adjusted to make sure that you don't fly away or suffocate. And if you're on the libertarian Arctic colony, the first thing you've got to do is check the heating levels to make sure you're not going to get hypothermia by the end of the day or something like that. If you're in some kind of left anarchist hippie-ish communal society, you might go drop your school kids off at the unschool, where they're going to just pursue their creative interest in finger paint all day or whatever. And then you'll go and tend your vegan garden or whatever. And I don't know, maybe if you're in the romantic medievalist kind of anarcho-feudalist society, maybe you'll practice sword fighting so you can fight off the Carsonites when they come to attack. And if you're in the left libertarian society, I don't know, maybe you'll go and maybe you'll stone somebody to death in town square for making a homophobic comment or something. So it's probably going to depend on, like I said, who you are and who you're with, what you're doing.
All right, terminal philosophy. What are your vision for day one in the life of Hapastan?
Yeah, well, it's hard to top Keith's answer, but I completely agree with him. It depends on where you're at in the world, and depends on the kind of the historical background of where you're at in the world too. I mean, you'd probably be taking a mountain bike to work, and probably working at here in where I'm at in kind of rural America, you'd probably be working at like a steel manufacturing plant, and things would be just more local in nature, and you'd probably, have to get to know your neighbor. Whether that's good or bad, I guess, is an entirely different philosophical conversation, but things would just be more local. There wouldn't be, you wouldn't be sitting in traffic on freeways, for an hour on your way back home. And I think hopefully, things like Netflix and Hulu would be nuked forever. So hopefully that would be gone. And I would imagine that, depending, if you're in places like Africa, again, it would just be more rural, agricultural, and homogeneous. And I suppose if you're in like a city like Portland or Seattle or something like that, there'd probably be a lot of rooftop gardens, and there'd be lots of, urban LGBT murals like there are now. And they'd be trying to figure out a way to keep that as a relevant social and political movement. But yeah, things would be more individualistic in a way, but they'd also be more group oriented. I think you would see, like an inverse of, when you look at a bell curve, when everyone's kind of more like in this hyper individualistic society, you'd kind of see an inverse of that. You'd have a more individualistic life in the sense that you'd keep yourself busier, probably, I would imagine, with more meaningful things, whatever that meaningfulness means to you with the society that you're in. And you'd also be more group oriented, because you have to be, because again, mass society, global finance, and the availability of credit is no longer here. So yeah, I think those are my initial thoughts. Thanks.
All right. Again, thanks, Swithun, Keith, Terminal Philosophy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.